Hello, welcome to Chapter 24, the Digestive System. Today we're going to go through all the different parts of the digestive system and how all of these parts work and what they contribute to the digestive system. So our digestive system is made up of a group of several different organs. Some are main organs, some are accessory organs. These main organs are the organs that food particles or chyme, bolus, all these different names for wherever the different food is within our system gets broken down into small enough particles that we can actually absorb and use these different particles. The full digestive canal starts at the mouth and it ends in the anus. So our digestive canal, we have that mouth that goes to the stomach, that goes to the small intestine, to the large intestine, to that anal canal. It can be up to 23 feet long. And then we have all those accessory organs. Our accessory organs assist with the process. So your teeth help to chew. Your tongue helps to move things around. Salivary glands, well, we need to moisten and start breaking things down as soon as we put it in our mouth. The pharynx, that's the back of our throat, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas. We're going to go through all of these different parts and what they do. So this image goes through all of the different organs of the digestive system. We have that mouth that has the teeth and the tongue. We have several different salivary glands. We have ones under our tongue, two different types. And then we have our parotid gland, which is back by our ear. When we go to swallow, food travels down that esophagus. It will travel into the stomach. The liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas all provide different juices to help break things down. After the stomach, the first place the food goes is the duodenum, then it goes to the jejunum, and then it goes to the ileum before it enters the cecum. We have our ascending colon, our transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon that goes to the rectum, anal canal, and then the anus. So the functions, there's 5 main functions of our digestive system. We're going to ingest. We take in food. Secretion. Well, we need ways to add moisture to food. We need ways to, or enzymes to break down food. Our stomach is very acidic, so acid. And then when we enter into that small intestine, we need some buffers to buffer that acid from the stomach. That mixing and propulsion, well, especially once food gets down to your stomach, it gets mixed around to further help break things down even more. Then digestion, that is the actual breakdown of food. And then we absorb, so that absorption, because we're absorbing different nutrients, different vitamins, glucose, fats, proteins, all of this different stuff is getting absorbed, and water, into our system to be utilized for energy, coenzymes, enzymes, to make hormones, to make proteins, all of this different stuff. So our digestive system does these 6 different processes as well. So we do ingest, just like the last slide says. So we do take in foods and liquids orally. Secretion. There's a lot of different places that we secrete different substances. We have those salivary glands that are secreting out liquids, but these liquids also have different enzymes. They have stuff, they have different things to break stuff down. We're secreting out mucus. We're secreting out water, acids, bases, or buffers. Everything needs to be able to travel, so it needs to move through that digestive system. And then digestion. We break things down until they are small enough to be absorbed, which is number 5. So we have mechanical digestion. That's where our teeth work. And then we have chemical digestion. This is where different enzymes or different particles are going to work to help break food down or things down to even smaller and smaller molecules. So that absorption is where things have been broken down far enough that we can actually absorb into our system. And then that defecation. Defecation is getting rid of any wastes, any indigestible substances. There are parts of our diet and foods that we eat that are not digestible. So like a lot of leafy greens for salads, a lot of those starches are not digestible. They act to help bulk up those feces. That's a lot of those indigestible substances. Bacteria, cells from that digestive cell or digestive canal. A lot of different things can be eliminated out. So this whole process, we take in food particles. We have different glands that are going to secrete out to help break apart. Things are going to move down this digestive canal. We break food particles down to smaller and smaller and smaller till they are small enough that we can absorb them. And then whatever is left is excreted through defecation. So most of our digestive canal has the same basic layers. There is a little bit of difference in some different areas. We'll talk about those when we get to those specific areas. But these are the 4 basic areas or layers to the digestive canal we're going to find throughout. So we have that mucosa or that mucous membrane. Of course, on the inside, we're going to have that epithelium. Depending on where it is going to determine what type of epithelium it is. Like our mouth has that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. That simple columnar epithelium, we see that in our stomach. We see that in our intestines. We get rid of these epithelial layers every 5 to 7 days. We get new cells that replace this. Those epithelial cells are going to connect to the lamina propria, which is that areolar connective tissue. Within this connective tissue, we have a lot of blood vessels. We also have a lot of lymphatic vessels because not everything can get absorbed into the bloodstream to travel around the body. We use the lymphatic system and those lymphatic vessels to absorb certain substances to travel where they need to get to in the body. In part of this lamina propria, we have that mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, that MALT that we talked about in the lymphatic system. We find it in certain areas and layers of our digestive system. Those lymphatic nodules. Because as we're eating things, as we take foods in, we need a way to protect ourselves from different diseases that may have found its way onto our food. We have a muscularis mucosa, smooth muscle. We need smooth muscle that goes through our digestive canal because it helps to move things along. It also helps to increase the surface area for digestion and absorption. Then we have that submucosa. That submucosa, again, is connective tissue. And it's going to hold that muscularis, that smooth muscle layer in place. Again, we have more blood vessels and more lymphatic vessels. We get this muscular layer. This muscular layer is skeletal muscle or smooth muscle. That mouth, that pharynx, and even the superior to middle portions of that esophagus are skeletal muscle because we need to voluntarily be able to swallow. That external anal sphincter is also skeletal muscle. We have control over when it's time to defecate and when it's not. The rest of that digestive canal is smooth muscle. And these are circular fibers in one layer, and then usually in outer longitudinal fibers as well. There's a serosa. This serosa, it is found within that abdominal cavity, and it's areolar connective tissue and simple squamous epithelium, or known as mesothelium. It's also can be called that visceral peritoneum. So it kind of lines that entire digestive canal, and it kind of helps to hold everything in your abdominal cavity in place. So here's all of these different layers. The lumen is the actual opening inside of that digestive canal. In this next layer of this mucosa, we have that epithelium, that lamina propria that has blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. Then we get that muscular layer. The next layer down, that's submucosa. Under that, we have 2 layers of muscle, followed by that outermost layer, which is that serosa. These are all working together to propel food forward, to help with absorption, to help with digestion. There's a lot of different things happening throughout. As we saw in this picture up here, the yellow, these are all nerves. This neural plexus that lines most of your digestive system. This is this enteric nervous system. May have heard of it as the brain of the gut because there's millions of neurons. These millions of neurons, my enteric nervous plexus, this is found in those muscle layers. And then we have our submucosal neural plexus, or the plexus of Meissner. This is found within that submucosa specifically, and it works to move things along. How fast something moves along. How strong those muscles contract to push something along. So these motor neurons, they're controlling. We even have motor neurons that control secretions. These secretions are going to work with neutralizing different acids, providing mucus to help things travel smoothly through that digestive canal. We even have sensory receptors. These sensory receptors are going to detect when something is in that digestive canal. We need those sensory receptors to kind of let us know, or at least let your brain know where something is. We also have chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors that are found within the walls of our digestive system, because they're going to find these different chemicals. These chemicals, they're searching for specific chemicals found within the foods. Mechanoreceptors are detecting stretch. They get activated when the walls of the digestive system, that small intestine, that large intestine, that stomach, when everything stretches, it activates the mechanoreceptors. So within this enteric nervous system, most of this information is going through that myenteric neural plexus. We have nerves that are going between the different muscle layers. We have nerves that go to that epithelium, and all of this information goes back through that enteric nervous system, but it also goes to the autonomic nervous system and the central nervous system, because it does play a role into what is happening within your digestive system. So how does this autonomic nervous system work with your digestive system? Most of the neurons of the enteric nervous system, they can function without the brain. They can function without the autonomic nervous system. But that autonomic nervous system is going to come in and take over. They can overcharge something that enteric nervous system is doing. That vagus nerve goes to just about every organ in the abdominal and thoracic cavity. So vagus nerve does parasympathetic. That parasympathetic is that rest and digest. So it allows foods to be moving through, and it increases secretions and motility. Most parasympathetic fibers comes from the vagus nerve. Some parasympathetic fibers are coming from the sacrospinal cord. And that would be parts that go to some parts of that large intestine, depending on where it is sitting. Sympathetic, that's that fight or flight. So the last thing you want to have to do when you're trying in that fight or flight stance, when you're trying to get away from something, is to have to go use the bathroom. So this sympathetic decreases secretions and motility. Even during anger, fear, anxiety, that can stimulate that sympathetic nervous system to slow down your digestive system. So we have different reflexes that are found within our digestive system. So most of these neurons in that enteric nervous system, they're part of this digestive canal reflex pathway. And it maintains how fast something is going, how much mucus and different secretions are coming out of that digestive system. So this reflex pathway has sensory neurons, just like skeletal muscle reflexes. A sensory neuron is going to detect something. So in this case, we have those chemoreceptors and those stretch receptors. This information is going to send, or these receptors are going to send this information about what kind of nutrients may be in our digestive system, those chemoreceptors, and the stretch that is being put on our digestive canal. Those stretch or mechanoreceptors. The neurons will either activate or inhibit those digestive canal glands. And it's just going to depend on what else is happening around, what else the body is going through at that time. So it can also take that smooth muscle and it can alter motility. How fast something is traveling through that digestive canal. Does it speed something up or does it slow something down? We have this peritoneum. And this is a serous membrane that is made of simple squamous epithelium with that areolar connective tissue underneath. Just like any other organs, we have a parietal peritoneum that faces out away. So it faces that wall of the abdominal cavity. And then we have that visceral peritoneum that actually lines the actual organs and sits on top of their serosa. We have that peritoneal cavity, just like with the heart and just like with the lungs. And again, it's going to be filled with fluid. Ascites is actually a condition where that peritoneal cavity becomes too full of fluids. It has way too many extra fluids in that area, which causes distension of that stomach. When we say something is retroperitoneal, we have some organs that are considered retroperitoneal. And what that means is they are on the posterior abdominal wall, and they only have that peritoneum on one side, their front side. So the kidneys, the ascending and descending colon of that large intestine, the duodenum, so that first part of the small intestine, and the pancreas are all considered retroperitoneal. They sit on the back of the abdominal wall, and they only have that peritoneum on their front. They don't also contain it on their back side. So this peritoneum, this is probably the best way to see it. This peritoneum has all of these different folds that go through it. We can see everything that is kind of happening when you take a mid-sagittal cut right down the middle of somebody here. We get this peritoneal cavity, which is all this space between all of these little holes. And then we have this visceral peritoneum that is lining the actual organs, while that parietal peritoneum is lining this entire abdominal cavity. So there's lots of folds in it, as we just looked at in that picture, because it's lining and weaving with all of the different organs that are there. These different folds are going to make the greater omentum, and that covers the front. It kind of goes over that transverse colon, parts of that small intestine, and it acts kind of like a fatty apron, as it's called. In the models in the lab, you can see the greater omentum that covers the front of most of that abdomen. The falciform ligament. This is what helps hold the liver to that anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm. So we have the liver, and you can kind of see this falciform ligament up towards the top, this little white area that I just colored yellow. We have the lesser omentum. You can see it's labeled here. This lesser omentum is part of the serosa of the stomach, the duodenum, and it helps like hold that stomach and that duodenum to the liver. The mesentery. This mesentery, as it's labeled through here, it helps to hold the jejunum and the ileum to the posterior abdominal wall. So that's the other two parts of the small intestine. And then we have the mesocolon. This mesocolon helps this transverse colon and the sigmoid colon. This is where blood and lymphatic vessels are found within that intestines. It's been part of that mesocolon. So we can see all of these different parts. Here's more of this greater omentum here that covers and goes through. This whole thing here is going to cover most of the organs in that abdominal cavity. Here's another view. This here is that omentum, that greater omentum, that yellow portion that is kind of found throughout. You can see when they pull that greater omentum away, we can start to see the mesocolon that's helping to hold everything together. We can see this falciform ligament that is found helping right through here. This lesser omentum helping to hold that stomach in place and attach that stomach up to that diaphragm. You even see the mesentery, which is all of this area within those intestines. So peritonitis. Peritonitis is where there's actually inflammation of that peritoneum. It could be because of microbes that have gotten into the peritoneum. And that happens because of usually surgical wounds that are not taken care of properly. So if bacteria gets into that peritoneal cavity, which can happen through an intestinal perforation, rupture of the appendix, it can actually be life-threatening. The less serious cause of peritonitis would be those peritoneal cavity or surfaces rubbing together, or they get inflamed. That's not as serious, but it's still cause for concern. So let's start going through all the different parts of the digestive system and how they help. We're going to start with the mouth because that is the first place any kind of foods, water, liquids, they're going to enter through the mouth. So we're going to start from where they enter in, and we'll go all the way through to where they will leave. So your mouth has the lips on the outside, the cheeks. We have that hard and soft palate, oral cavity, teeth, salivary glands, and tongue. So those cheeks, we have that buccinator muscle in there. We have a mucous membrane that's going to cover it. Your lips. These surround the opening of your mouth. That orbicularis oris muscle is the one right outside of your lips. On the inner surface, we have this labial frenulum. And this is where the lips attach to the gums. So when we're chewing, that buccinator muscle and that orbicularis oris muscle are what keep food inside of your mouth. And instead of between your teeth and your gums and front of your teeth, they keep them behind your teeth. Inside of our oral cavity. The oral cavity is considered from the lips and teeth to the fauces. It is divided into the oral vestibule and the oral cavity proper. So that oral vestibule, it is by the cheeks and lips and by the gums and the teeth. The oral cavity proper, it goes from the gums and the teeth to the fauces, which is the opening between the oral cavity and the oral pharynx. So that's all the way in the back. The palate. This is kind of a septum that separates that oral cavity from that nasal cavity. So that hard and soft palate that makes up the roof of your mouth. This is how we can chew food and breathe at the same time because they are separated. That hard palate is made up by that maxilla bone and the palatine bones behind it. And again, they're all covered with that mucous membrane. And then that soft palate is further back. And it has that nice arch with that kind of uvula that pops down. So that uvula, when we swallow, that soft palate goes up. It should close off that opening between the nasal pharynx and the oral pharynx to prevent any food or liquid from getting into your nasal cavity. Between the uvula, we have the palatoglossal arch and the palatopharyngeal arch. These are different areas just between the uvula and the sides of your mouth. The palatine tonsils and the lingual tonsils are found back in this area. So let's look at some of the stuff we talked about. The frenulum, we mentioned that's that flap of skin that comes down. We have that hard palate and that soft palate with the uvula in the back. We have these fauces. We have those different arches. The palatoglossal arch, the palatopharyngeal arch. Here we can see those palatine tonsils right back here. We have lots of different teeth. Here's that lingual frenulum. It is found underneath the tongue. So these different salivary glands. These salivary glands are going to release saliva into the mouth. So when food first enters your mouth, the secretion to these salivary glands increases because we want to make sure the mouth is moist enough. So when food comes in contact with the saliva, it helps to dissolve that food. And it even begins the chemical breakdown of food. We have minor and major salivary glands. The minor salivary glands are found just in the mucosa and the submucosa. And they're just going to open up into that oral cavity. While these major salivary glands, we have that parotid gland that is in the back of our cheek, kind of below our ear. submandibular on the floor underneath your tongue, floor of your mouth under your tongue. And then we have those sublingual glands, again, under the tongue and towards the mouth. So here is that parotid gland. It's a pretty large one in the back of your cheek. There's a little duct, the parotid duct, that brings the saliva from that parotid salivary gland and opens it into the mouth. Here we can see those submandibular underneath the tongue. Or no, that's the sublingual, sorry. That's the sublingual. Here's the submandibular. Down at the very bottom in the back of your chin, like of your chin area. Sublingual, lingual for tongue, so it's under the tongue. Submandibular, it's just under the chin almost. Saliva, it's mostly water. But there are some important substances that we have in saliva. One of the main is that salivary amylase. Salivary amylase is an ACE, so it's an enzyme, and it breaks down starches. The breaking down of starches happens in the mouth. We also get some bicarbonate in there, so when we take something acidic in, it starts to buffer in the mouth to begin with. When your salivary glands start to salivate or release out saliva into the mouth, it is actually controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We can secrete up to 1,500 milliliters of saliva in a day. The parasympathetic nervous system promotes secretion of saliva. Saliva gets swallowed. That is one of the ways we keep that lumen of the esophagus moist. We reabsorb most of our saliva back out of our digestive canal because our body likes to reuse things as much as possible, and this is one way for our body to reuse as much as we can. Just like the parasympathetic nervous system increases salivation, that sympathetic decreases salivation, which is why when you have a high level of stress, when you're exercising, you can feel this dry mouth type of feeling. Even when your body is dehydrated, your salivary glands are going to play a role. They don't secrete as much because they're trying to conserve water. Our body needs to divert water to other areas, so it does not get secreted into the mouth. And this is what gives that dry mouth sensation when you're thirsty, because that dry mouth sensation should stimulate you to drink something. Mumps. Mumps is a vaccine that's out that works against this mumps virus. But what mumps does is it actually attacks those parotid glands. So those parotid glands become enlarged. They can cause fever, malaise, or discomfort. They can cause pain in your throat. They can start to swell making that area in the back of by your ears where those parotid glands sit to be very large. Since there is a vaccine out for it, and it's part of the childhood recommendations at certain points to get that mumps vaccine. It's usually in a combination for measles, mumps, and rubella all in one. But that vaccine has helped to reduce the cases of mumps within the US at least. Onto your tongue. Your tongue is technically an accessory organ. It is all skeletal muscle, so we do have control over how our tongue moves. Because our tongue is used when we talk, it's used when we chew. We need to have control over it, so it's skeletal muscle. The whole floor of that oral cavity, so underneath the tongue is skeletal muscle. And then all of the muscles that come up that make up the tongue are also skeletal muscle. So we have extrinsic muscles of the tongue, and then we have intrinsic muscles of the tongue. These extrinsic muscles help your tongue move different directions. So this would be the hypoglossus, genioglossus, and styloglossus. They help your tongue so you can stick your tongue out. You can move your tongue from side to side. You can put your tongue up to the roof of your mouth. These are all done because of the extrinsic muscles. These intrinsic muscles are the actual muscles that make up the entire tongue. Superior longitudinal lingual, inferior longitudinal lingual, transverse linguae, and verticalis linguae muscles. So underneath the tongue, we have that lingual frenulum, which I showed in that picture a few slides ago. Ankyloglossia. This person may have a very short or very stiff lingual frenulum, and they have a harder time talking. So this person is said to be tongue-tied. We have the lingual papilla. This is on these part of the tongue. It is used for taste. Some of them just increase the friction of the tongue to help your tongue move around easier, but this is what makes up most of the surface of that tongue. We have those lingual glands. These lingual glands secrete lingual lipase. Lipase for lipids. So triglycerides are a liquid, so they are going to help break down triglycerides. Because we can't absorb triglycerides as they are, we need to break them down into smaller substances before they can actually be absorbed. Now our teeth. Our teeth, again, they're technically accessory organs that sit in sockets or dental alveoli. They are rooted up into the mandible and the maxilla. Maxilla for the top, mandible for your bottom teeth. All of your teeth are covered by gingiva or gums. And these extend part of the way up your teeth. Inside of each socket that your teeth sit in, there is a ligament that helps to hold your teeth in place. This is this periodontal ligament. This periodontal ligament is actually partly attached to the periodontium which is what lines the inside of that socket. And the periodontal ligament attaches to that periodontum, and then it attaches to the teeth. It works as a shock absorber when you're chewing. So if you chew on something and you hit something hard, instead of shooting that tooth up into that bone, that ligament kind of absorbs that shock instead. So all of our teeth have different regions. We have a crown, and this is the portion we see, is the crown, the root, and then the neck. Depending on the type of tooth, it can have one root, it can have up to 3 roots, just depending on where that tooth is located. The neck is found at that gum line. So now the layers of the teeth. Dentin is what makes up most of our teeth. It is extremely hard. And it gives your tooth its shape. It makes your teeth hard. Dentin is technically considered harder than bone. We have dentinal tubules. We have odontoblasts that produce this dentin. These different dental tubules, if they get exposed because of erosion, that enamel gets worn away, certain substances that can kind of erode away at this enamel can actually result in dentin hypersensitivity because it activates pain receptors. So when something cold or hot, even something touches some of these teeth where this enamel has eroded away, it can be very painful. Now the enamel. The enamel is what covers that dentin, and it's mostly calcium phosphate. There's some calcium carbonate in there. Again, it's harder than bone. It is the hardest surface in our body, this enamel, because it protects your teeth. It protects those different layers of your teeth and helps keep them healthy, per se. So we also have the dentin of the root is covered by cement. So that bottom, we have cement, and it helps to attach that root to the periodontal ligament. I have pictures. So this enamel, it is this outermost layer. This is the whites of the teeth that we see on your teeth specifically. The dentin is this layer underneath. These little dental tubules here, if they get exposed anywhere, this is what causes that sensitivity to hot, cold, different chemicals. That gingiva we said was the gums that covers parts of that the neck of the tooth per se. That crown at the top is the visible. That neck is where that gingiva or gums sit, and then that root is everything underneath. The cement was the next part that was mentioned here. The cement is this portion through here. This is what makes up the cement. So inside of the tooth now. If we go inside of the tooth, we have this pulp cavity. It is the opening inside of the tooth where blood vessels come in, where nerves come in, even lymphatic vessels. are going to be found in this pulp cavity. And then we have root canals. And this is what runs through that bottom portion of that tooth. These root canals have an opening at the bottom known as the apical foramen. And this is where all these blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves get into the tooth. So let's look here. This opening, we can see this whole area, and here is this pulp cavity. And then we have this. This is this root canal where this nerve and these blood vessels come in. That apical foramen down here at the bottom is where these nerves and blood vessels are going to enter the tooth. So all humans have two sets of teeth. The first type is this deciduous teeth, or your primary or baby teeth. They usually start to come in at about 6 months of age. At about 6 months, the first two teeth out of the 20 primary or baby teeth come in. They keep coming in every month or so until all 20 of those primary teeth are there. These decuseous or baby teeth, we have incisors. Incisors are the teeth in the front. They have that thin kind of chisel cut to them. They're made for cutting into food, so taking bites of something. We have the central and then the lateral, the two in the middle and then the ones on each side. The canines, those are those pointy teeth. They are used for tearing and shredding of food. And then we get their first and second deciduous molars. And they're finished grinding up food and crushing food so we can swallow them down. Between the ages of 6 and 12, we lose those deciduous teeth and we get permanent teeth that come in. Our permanent teeth have somewhat of the same pattern. These first and second deciduous molars are replaced with first and second premolars. And then about 6 years old, those first permanent molars start to come in, then those second permanent molars, these third permanent molars. If they come in, they will come in after the age of 17 usually. Not everybody gets them. Some people get lucky and they don't get these third permanent molars, or also known as wisdom teeth. The human jaw is not usually large enough. We don't usually have enough room to accommodate these third molars. So sometimes these third molars can remain embedded, or also called impacted. Sometimes when this happens, depending on where they're at, how they're impacted, they may need to be removed to allow for the rest of your teeth to have enough space. So we went through all of these different parts of the teeth here. The only thing I think I missed was this periodontal ligament. This periodontal ligament here is this little ligaments that go through here that are holding this tooth here in place. This is all working to keep your tooth where it should. Now on to these different teeth. Baby teeth or deciduous primary teeth are usually labeled with letters. We get those central incisors, those two middle teeth, and then we get lateral incisors, the ones next to it. The canines are those pointy teeth. Then in our baby teeth, we get those first and those secondary molars. In an adult, the main difference, we have the same teeth up till here, but we get that first molar, that second molar, and that third molar, or that wisdom tooth, if your mouth is large enough. A root canal. A root canal is where they actually take that dental pulp tissue and all of that is removed. And it's taken out of that pulp cavity of diseased teeth. So they make a hole in the top of the tooth and they're going to remove that dental pulp tissue out. They're going to clean out that tooth. And then they're going to seal it. They treat it with medication, they seal it, and then eventually they put a crown on, depending on how damaged the top of the tooth is. If the top of the tooth is not damaged, they may not put a crown on. It all just depends on what that tooth is like. So this is everything that we're going to find in the mouth. We have that lingual lipase that's going to break down triglycerides or fats. And then the other enzyme that we have is that salivary amylase that's going to break down starches. These are the two food products that start being broken down in the mouth. Pharynx. We looked at the pharynx when we looked at the respiratory system. So let's kind of briefly go through that pharynx again. That pharynx has that nasopharynx, which is for breathing only. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx have digestive functions. So when we swallow food, it's going to go into that oropharynx, down to that laryngopharynx, and it's going to enter into that esophagus. So the esophagus. The esophagus is usually about 10 inches long. It sits behind the trachea. So it starts at the end of that laryngopharynx. It goes through the mediastinum. It goes through the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus, where it is going to enter the stomach. It has that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Because think as you're swallowing things down, that stratified squamous epithelium is made to protect against abrasion. Well, that abrasion that can happen in the esophagus is all taken care of by that stratified squamous epithelium. We have that lamina propria and then that muscularis mucosa. It starts a skeletal muscle at the top. So the top third of the esophagus is skeletal muscle. The rest is smooth muscle. We have an upper esophageal sphincter. Again, it's skeletal muscle. And that allows food from the pharynx to enter into the esophagus. We have a lower esophageal sphincter. This one is smooth muscle and it regulates the food movement from the esophagus to the stomach. The outermost layer is that adventitia. Again, connective tissue. So here is an esophagus. Those different layers. We get that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. That mucosa. You see that lamina propria? You see that muscularis mucosa. Then we get that submucosa. Muscle layer. 2 layers of muscles going different directions. Then that adventitia on the outside. Swallowing or deglutition. That is the process of food going from the mouth to the stomach. So it happens in 3 steps. That first part is the voluntary. Once we chew food up, it turns into a bolus. And that goes in from your mouth into that oropharynx. The pharyngeal stage is when this bolus that goes through the pharynx into the esophagus. So we have different receptors in that oropharynx, which lets your brain know that we're swallowing stuff down. And when we go to swallow, that soft palate and that uvula goes to block off that nasopharynx, so food and liquids can only travel one direction, down, not up, down. The esophageal phase. This is involuntary. The bolus that goes through the esophagus and ends in the stomach. Once this esophagus goes into the, especially the smooth muscle portion of the esophagus, this is where peristalsis occurs. Peristalsis, I'll go to the picture in a minute, but here we have this bolus. It swallows down. And as we go to swallow, that soft palate goes up to block off the nasal cavity, which allows that bolus to go down. That epiglottis that we can see open here, that epiglottis goes down to cover that trachea to prevent that food or water from entering the trachea. So it only has one place to go, down the esophagus. Peristalsis. Peristalsis is a series of contractions that pushes the muscle or pushes the bolus of food forward. So as this food comes through, this area contracts, which pushes this bolus down. Then the next area contracts, which pushes it down further. This area will contract to push it down further, and it continues in a series of squeezing to cause that bolus to make it into that stomach, past that lower esophageal sphincter. So when peristalsis is occurring, these muscles squeeze. And what causes these muscles to squeeze is this stretching. Stretching of that smooth muscle causes smooth muscle to contract. The smooth muscle contracts and closes in, which will allow that bolus to be pushed further and further down. And it happens in waves until that food makes it all the way down. So each time you swallow something, these peristaltic waves are happening just above where that bolus is, squeezing in to help push that bolus down. So here's all the different stages in the pharynx and the esophagus. GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. It actually deals with the lower esophageal sphincter. If it does not close after food has entered the stomach, the contents is that stomach is moving that bolus around to break it down even further, can actually cause the contents of the stomach, including the acids in the stomach, to go back up into that esophagus. One of the juices that our stomach makes is hydrochloric acid. It is very acidic. This hydrochloric acid can irritate, it burns that esophageal wall, that stratified squamous epithelium. And that's what gives that heartburn sensation, because where it's all happening is close to where the heart is. So that's where it got the name heartburn. Drinking alcohol, smoking can cause that sphincter to relax. It worsens the problem. Certain foods like coffee, chocolate, tomatoes, fatty foods, orange juice, peppermint, spearmint, and onions, they stimulate more acid secretion. By stimulating more acid secretion, if that lower esophageal sphincter doesn't close completely, it increases that heartburn. There's different over-the-counter medications like Tegament, Pepcid AC, Tums, Maalox that can help kind of neutralize some of the acids in the stomach to help prevent this. It's also been found that symptoms are less likely to occur if they swallow down smaller amounts of food at a time. Don't swallow huge loads of food. So if this esophageal sphincter here does not completely close back up, when that stomach is churning and moving whatever the contents around, those contents can travel back up that esophagus. Stomach. In your stomach, it is a enlargement that sits right below the diaphragm. The stomach at the top, the esophagus attaches to it. At the bottom is the duodenum, which is part of that small intestine. When food enters that stomach, it gets churned up, gets mixed up. There's different acids in there to help break down specific foods and particles. And what is going to happen is small quantities of this material, now called chyme, gets pushed into that small intestine, very small portions at a time. I'll go through. Digestion of starches and triglycerides will continue in the stomach. We start to break down proteins in the stomach. We have many different layers to the stomach and different areas. The very top portion that actually extends up higher, this is the fundus. The fundus is the top. We have the first part of the stomach that is past that lower esophageal sphincter that is known as the cardia. The body of the stomach is most of the stomach here. The next area is we have this pyloric antrum. Makes up this whole area. The pyloric canal leads to this pyloric sphincter right through here. This is the sphincter that allows tiny bits of that chyme to travel into that duodenum. Erase this for a minute because we're going to look at something else now on this picture. We have what is known as this greater curvature. This greater curvature follows the larger side of the outside of the stomach. The lesser curvature is just the smaller curve of the stomach. The next part of the stomach is our stomach has 3 layers of muscle. We talked about the 2 layers that make up most of the digestive system. Our stomach has 3. The innermost layer is this oblique layer of fibers. The middle layer is circular fibers. And the outermost layer are these longitudinal fibers. Inside of our stomach, we have all these little folds that are happening throughout. All of these little folds that are happening, here lists them as gastric folds. They are known as rugae. The rugae of the stomach increases that surface area. So what does our stomach do exactly? Well, it takes that bolus that we swallowed down and it turns it into this soupy liquid. I like that term from your book. And that is known as the chyme. It holds the food until it is ready to be released into that small intestine. It secretes different juices, that hydrochloric acid that I mentioned. Hydrochloric acid kills bacteria. It also denatures or breaks down proteins. We have pepsin, which helps aid in the digestion of proteins. We secrete out intrinsic factor. We need intrinsic factor to be able to absorb vitamin B12 in our intestines. We also have gastric lipase. That is going to help continue breaking down triglycerides. Your stomach secretes the hormone gastrin. Gastrin is supposed to be the hormone that helps to let us know that we're full. So I went through all of these different parts. I showed them all on the picture above where everything is. Here's that rugae that makes up those different folds. Here, you can actually see all of these different folds within the stomach. This is a really good stomach here. You can even see the fundus of this stomach. It's a really good, so that very top portion of that stomach. Pylorospasms or pyloric stenosis. This is something that happens in infants. So a pylorospasm, these sphincters, they don't relax normally. So food sits in the stomach because that sphincter does not relax to allow that chyme to go from the stomach to the small intestine. So that stomach becomes too full, and that infant, the only way to get rid of that pressure now is to vomit. This is when we try to relax that pyloric sphincter so that this food can travel from the stomach into that small intestine. Pyloric stenosis is when that pyloric sphincter is very small. They have to surgically correct it. This baby or infant has projectile vomiting. Let's look at some of the different cells that we have within our stomach. I talked about we have some of these different areas. We've got this surface mucosa, mostly simple columnar epithelium. We have these gastric glands that are going to secrete out different juices. We have gastric pits. These gastric pits are these areas that kind of go down. So the different cells that we have mucous neck cells, chief cells, and parietal cells. They're going to make all the different gastric juices. The parietal cells specifically secrete intrinsic factor. They also secrete hydrochloric acid. Again, that intrinsic factor is secreted so we can absorb that vitamin B12. Hydrochloric acid is going to help denature those proteins and kill bacteria. That makes that stomach a very acidic environment. Those chief cells, they're going to secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Those G cells, gastrin. So all of these different cells are found within the walls of the stomach, and they're going to secrete their specific substances to help absorb or break down different substances. So we can see they color-coded for us, those mucous neck cells versus those parietal cells, those chief cells, and those those G cells. They all work to help us break down and absorb anything that we have brought into our stomach. I went through the different layers of the muscle, those muscular layers, that longitudinal, circular, and oblique. That oblique layer is only found in that stomach. So once food enters that stomach, we're going to start getting peristaltic waves go through the stomach even. These peristaltic waves are going to help propel food down through the stomach, and it's going to keep propelling them until it reaches that antrum. That pyloric sphincter remains closed. And it remains closed because it wants to make sure particles are broken down small enough to fit through. This is where we have retropulsion. These food particles get pushed back into the body of the stomach. We were trying to break things down even further. And until they remain, they keep going back through this retropulsion again and again until they are small enough to fit through that pyloric sphincter. And that is where they get that kind of liquidy kind of chyme. Our stomach only releases out about 3 milliliters worth of chyme at a time. So it releases out a very small quantity every time it releases something out of that pyloric sphincter at the bottom of the stomach. Here's the interesting part. When food first enters the stomach, it enters into the fundus first. It can sit in that fundus for up to an hour before it starts to mix. Our salivary amylase is continuing to work in that fundus. Eventually, that churning and mixing with those gastric juices will inactivate that salivary amylase, and it actually takes until the gastric juices to actually activate that lingual lipase. The parietal cells in the stomach are going to secrete hydrogen ions, chloride ions, which the lumen of that stomach will make to hydrochloric acid. Proton pumps. These are what take these hydrogen ions into that lumen to make that hydrochloric acid. Carbonic anhydrase gets formed. So we get carbonic acid as one of our byproducts from these proton pumps. And it also generates some bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate is going to enter the bloodstream. And after a meal, it can actually be enough to make your system more alkaline or basic. Hydrochloric acid secretion, that acetylcholine, gastrin, histamine can also stimulate that hydrochloric acid secretion. So we're making bicarbonate to go into the bloodstream as we're secreting out these hydrogen and chloride ions to make hydrochloric acid. To make the hydrochloric acid, we need acetylcholine binding to that acetylcholine receptor, gastrin binding to that gastrin receptor, and histamine that will bind to that histamine receptor to be able to secrete out that hydrochloric acid. Our stomach is acidic enough to kill microbes that may be found in food because it denatures or unfolds proteins, which this happening, breaking down and unfolding proteins, actually will stimulate the secretion of different hormones that cause bile that's made in the liver, stored in the gallbladder, and pancreatic juices to be secreted. Pepsin is an enzyme, and it kind of gives us some of these peptide bonds between amino acids. It's effective in acidic environments only. Pepsin is actually secreted as pepsinogen, and the acidic environment coming in contact with that hydrochloric acid causes pepsinogen to become pepsin, which is that active form in the stomach. Our stomach is lined with those epithelial cells. These epithelial cells are protected from this very acidic environment because of this alkaline mucus that is secreted by mucus surface mucus cells. Just work to just protect those cells specifically. Gastric lipase. Again, we're splitting our triglycerides. They're going to fatty acids and monoglycerides. Tri is 3. We're splitting it down to one chain of glyceride molecules. We can absorb water. We can absorb some ions, some short chain fatty acids. We can absorb aspirin and alcohol from our stomach. Everything else needs to travel further into our digestive system before they can be absorbed. It takes 2 to 4 hours after you eat a meal for your stomach to completely empty its contents into that duodenum, which is that next chain in the step, that small intestine. Something that has a lot of carbohydrates spends the least amount of time in the stomach because it's already started, it's being broken down by that salivary amylase in the mouth. It gets down to the stomach and it's broken down a lot quicker. Proteins remain a lot longer, which is why when you eat proteins with your meal, it helps you to feel full longer because they remain in the stomach longer. Fatty foods stay in your stomach the longest because those fats take longer to break down. So these are all the different parts and the cells that are found in the stomach, what they secrete, and what they do. Vomiting. Vomiting, or emesis, is when contents of that upper digestive canal, could be the stomach, it can sometimes even be that duodenum, are forcefully pushed through the mouth. The strongest stimulus is irritation and distension of the stomach. Unpleasant sights. General anesthesia can cause some people vomiting. Dizziness, drugs. Morphine can cause people to vomit. Digitalis. There is a vomiting center in the medulla that nerve impulses are sent to, and then those returning impulses actually causes vomiting, which squeezes that stomach contents back up through that esophagus, through those esophageal sphincters, and out. Prolonged vomiting, especially in infants and elderly, can be very serious because that hydrochloric acid, it can cause alkalosis. It can cause dehydration, out too much. Acids, those acids that hit that esophagus, those acids that hit that teeth can erode your esophagus, can erode your teeth. An accessory organ, the pancreas. We looked at it a little bit when we looked at the endocrine system for insulin and glucagon. Now we're going to look at the pancreas and how it relates to the digestive system. The pancreas is retroperitoneal. It is behind the stomach. The head is the larger area, this large area, the neck, and then the tail is this long portion. It is connected to the duodenum. So here we can see the pancreas. We have this pancreatic duct that opens up through 2 different areas into that first portion of the small intestine, or the duodenum. We also have this bile duct that is coming down from the liver and or the gallbladder. So our pancreas, it's going to secrete different juices. As we mentioned, it's an endocrine and an exocrine organ. We talked about the endocrine in the endocrine chapter. Now we're going to talk about the exocrine here. We have the pancreatic duct, and it joins up with the bile duct from the liver and the gallbladder, creating the hepatopancreatic ampulla. This hepatopancreatic ampulla is going to open up into that duodenal mucosa. These different juices that come out, we have a sphincter. The sphincter of the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or I learned it as the sphincter of Oddi. Your textbook mentions that one as well. This is where these different juices are regulated on how they send everything out. We also have an accessory duct, and it lies above that hepatopancreatic ampulla. So we looked at the pancreatic acini, or we looked at the pancreatic isolates, I'm sorry. Those are the ones that make the different hormones. Those are the endocrine organs. The pancreatic acini are what make up the pancreatic juice, and it is made of different fluids and digestive enzymes. So what all comes out of this pancreatic juice? Well, there's some water, salts, sodium bicarbonate. There's a reason for bicarbonate. Think how acidic those gastric juices are from the stomach. We need to neutralize it. And then there's several enzymes. So that bicarbonate makes that pancreatic juice more alkaline because we need to buffer the acidity of that chyme coming out of the stomach. That alkaline actually stops that pepsin, because remember that pepsin only works in acidic environments. Well, once we neutralize that acid, that pepsin will no longer work because it only works when it's acidic. That bicarbonate changes that pH so different digestive enzymes can work. We get pancreatic amylase. Amylase is always for starches. We have trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, and elastase. Proteins, pancreatic lipase, triglycerides. We have ribonuclease and deoxyribonuclease. RNA and DNA breaks those down to nucleotides. Pancreatitis and pancreatic cancer. Itis, an inflammation of the pancreas. Somebody who gets inflammation of the pancreas, it's usually associated with alcohol abuse or gallstones. So stones in the gallbladder. Acute pancreatitis, heavy alcohol, biliary tract obstruction. So one of those gallstones in the gallbladder gets stuck somewhere in that tract between the gallbladder and where that bile is released into that duodenum. Pancreatic cancer is usually found in people over the age of 50, and this is something that is found more common in males. Unfortunately, we don't always find it until they are in their advanced stages, where it is again already metastasized, traveled somewhere else. Unfortunately, pancreatic cancer is almost always fatal. Fatty foods, high alcohol consumption, sometimes genetic, smoking. Chronic pancreatitis can also play a role into pancreatic cancer. So the liver and the gallbladder. Again, some more accessory organs. The liver, it's covered by that visceral peritoneum completely. We have a right lobe and a left lobe that is separated by that falciform ligament. That falciform ligament kind of goes up to that diaphragm and helps to suspend that liver, attaching it to that diaphragm. There's a free border on that falciform ligament that's known as the ligamentum teres. This is actually a remnant of the umbilical vein. So we still have this to this day. We have coronary ligaments, the right and the left, that also help to hold that liver to the diaphragm. Then that gallbladder is attached to the liver. The gallbladder has a fundus, a body, and a neck. Just looking for a picture. Don't see it. Sorry. Thought I had one. So inside of the liver, we have these cells that are called hepatocytes. Hepato for liver. They are going to perform metabolic activities. They secrete, and they also have endocrine functions. And they're going to make up almost 80% of the liver. So they're kind of in this circular 3-day arrangement, or this hepatic lamina. And these hepatic lamina, they are these branched, and they form these grooves where this bile canaliculi come through, and they're going to make bile. This bile is a digestive product. So this bile canaliculi, it's that duct. It's a duct that's found between the hepatocytes, and it's going to collect the bile that is being made. So we have the canaliculi that make the bile ducts, ductiles that go to the bile ducts. Then we have the right and left hepatic duct, and they're going to unite for the common hepatic duct. From here, the bile goes into the duodenum, and it helps with digestion. We have these hepatic sinusoids. And this is areas that are very permeable to blood. This is where we receive oxygenated blood from the hepatic artery specifically. And then we get nutrients from the hepatic portal vein. This is part of this portal triad. The bile duct, hepatic artery, and hepatic vein is known as the portal triad. So here we can kind of see this portal triad. We have this hepatic portal vein, hepatic artery, and see going through, you see that inferior vena cava. This is all part of that. You can kind of see, not the best, but this bile duct. It's going to be found in green. So the hepatic acinus is those hepatocytes, bile system, and those hepatic sinusoids. And then we have our gallbladder. Our gallbladder is simple columnar epithelium. They have those mucosal folds, just like the stomach did. The gallbladder is going to eject its fluids into this cystic duct. So let's look. We have all of these different hepatocytes. We can see all of these hepatic sinusoids, so these openings, and they're going to kind of drain out that bile that is being made by these hepatocytes. We have that hepatic portal vein, the hepatic artery, and that bile duct that make up this portal triad. Here we can see it even further broken down. Here is this bile duct, that hepatic portal vein, that hepatic artery. We see all of these hepatic sinusoids. So these are all working to get nutrients, get rid of, and absorb bile. Here we can see it in a actual slice on the microscope. We can see as it gets smaller or larger and larger and larger, you can see that portal triad. You can see all these different sinusoids and those different hepatocytes throughout. So ducts that carry bile, we have that right hepatic duct and that left hepatic duct that come together to make that common hepatic duct from the liver. From here, it's going to go down to that bile duct. It'll go through that pancreatic, it'll carry through that pancreatic duct, hepatopancreatic duct. If it's not needed, the bile, it'll go back up and it gets stored in that gallbladder until it is needed. When it is needed, it'll be released back out and it'll go out into that duodenum to help break things down. So the liver receives blood from two places. It's going to receive oxygenated blood from the hepatic artery. And then we also receive blood from the hepatic portal vein. The hepatic portal vein has just received nutrients that have been absorbed in the intestines. It could receive drugs, microbes, and toxins. These are all coming from that digestive canal. They go to the hepatic portal vein that goes to the liver before it goes back to the heart. Both the hepatic artery and the hepatic portal vein is going to take blood to those sinusoids. Oxygen and the nutrients are going to be taken up by those hepatocytes. So both that hepatic artery and that hepatic portal vein are going to those hepatic sinusoids. It'll go to the central vein, hepatic vein, inferior vena cava to the heart. Jaundice. Jaundice is a yellowing of the skin, and it is usually because of the liver. It usually signifies some sort of liver something, depending on the age. You can see it in the skin, you can see it in the eyes, depending on how dark somebody's skin is. You can usually see it in their nail beds. You can sometimes see it in those mucous membranes, so their gums and their mouth. There's another place to look for some of this stuff. And it is because of a buildup of bilirubin. Bilirubin is formed when we break down red blood cells. We have prehepatic jaundice, too much bilirubin being produced. Hepatic jaundice is from liver disease, cirrhosis, or hepatitis. Extrahepatic jaundice. It could be because of gallstones, cancer of the bowel, or pancreas. The liver of a newborn doesn't function very well. This is why there's a lot of babies that may have some mild form of jaundice, which is neonatal jaundice. And it disappears as that newborn ages. It's something that's pretty common in newborns. So the hepatocytes secrete bile. The liver secretes the bile. I know people think the bile comes from the gallbladder. The gallbladder is going to store it. The liver makes it. So bilirubin is what gives us the pigment of that bile. It gets broken down in the intestines. One product is stercobilin, which is what gives your feces that brown color. But what bile does is it's going to emulsify fats. So it takes fat, completely engulfs it, takes these fats inside of it, these little globules of bile, and breaks it down into smaller and smaller pieces so that this pancreatic lipase can digest it down quicker. So bile helps to break down lipids, and it helps to absorb lipids. It also does carbohydrate metabolism. So glucose, we store glucose in the liver in that form of glycogen, which is those chains of glucose molecules. We can break down that glycogen into those glucose molecules and release them out into the bloodstream if our blood glucose levels are too low. We can store those glucose as glycogen when the blood glucose is too high. The liver can actually take amino acids and lactic acid and turn it into glucose. The liver can take excess glucose, we store it as glycogen. We can turn glucose into triglycerides. We can turn glucose into fats. Sugars can get converted to fats in our liver. Something to think about. And then that lipid metabolism. We can make ATP from lipids, from fatty acids, from triglycerides. We can make lipoproteins. We make cholesterol. Part of these bile salts that help to emulsify fats are made from cholesterol. Our liver does protein metabolism. We can break down proteins for energy. Our liver makes most of the proteins found in our blood. We can process drugs and hormones. So our liver works to detoxify our blood. So alcohol, penicillin, erythromycin, sulfamides, we can turn those into bile. We can alter thyroid hormones. We can excrete thyroid hormones. We can alter or excrete steroid hormones. That excretion of bilirubin. It gets metabolized in that small intestine in the bacteria or by the bacteria, and then we eliminate it in our feces. Those bile salts that emulsifies and aids in the absorption of fats. We store glycogen. We store vitamins. We store iron and copper, so minerals, until we need them at other times. Phagocytosis. Those aged red blood cells. We get rid of those aged red blood cells. We activate vitamin D. So the skin, the liver, and the kidneys help make those active forms of vitamin D. Gallstones. Gallstones, these look more like cholesterol gallstones. Having too many fats in your diet can cause cholesterol type of gallstones to be formed. And these gallstones can sit in the gallbladder, they can actually be ejected out because that gallbladder will squeeze to contract to help push out bile when it's needed. So when it may go to squeeze out that bile when it's needed, it can squeeze out some of those gallstones and then they get stuck in those ducts. And that causes a lot of other problems. You have high levels of calcium in your body, you can make calcified stones. There's a lot of different things that can happen. Our small intestine. We're back to our primary organs of the digestive system. Our small intestine is made of it has three different parts. We have the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum is what the stomach empties its contents out of into that small intestine. It starts at the end of the stomach and it goes to the jejunum. The jejunum means empty. So it's that middle portion that works on absorbing different nutrients. But the ileum is the longest region of the actual small intestine. And it's going to end at this ileal orifice, which will empty into the large intestine. So here's those gallstones. These gallstones, they may have too much cholesterol, as I had mentioned. They can start to grow in size and number if you keep having too much cholesterol, not enough salts or lecithin. It can obstruct the flow of bile. So they do have gallstone dissolving drugs. It depends on what the gallstones are made of. If they're made of cholesterol, they can use these gallstone dissolving drugs. They can do some shockwave, or they may surgically have to remove the gallbladder, which is cholecystectomy. That is the actual removal of the gallbladder and any of its contents. To prevent side effects, you're supposed to limit your intake of saturated fats, which most doctors do not tell you after you've had your gallbladder removed. I was never given a diet after my gallbladder was removed. I was just sent on my happy little way. Avoiding the consumption of alcoholic beverages, eating smaller meals, taking vitamins and mineral supplements, digestive enzymes can minimize, if you take one right before a meal, it can minimize any side effects from that bile because your liver has to learn to make bile and have it secreted and ready to go, but there's no place to store it. So it is got to be making it almost on demand. So here is that jejunum makes up this area. The ileum makes up most of this. And here's that duodenum portion coming down. So what does our small intestine do exactly? Going to mix that chyme with those different pancreatic juices, the bile. It's going to make sure that food comes in contact with that mucosa so we can absorb it. That small intestine uses peristalsis to push that chyme through that small intestine. We are going to finish breaking down carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, and we start and finish the breakdown of nucleic acids. We absorb most of our nutrients in water that pass through the small intestine. This is where most of the absorption is going to happen, is that small intestine. We have different cells found in the small intestine again. We have absorptive cells, goblet cells, we have intestinal glands, Paneth cells, They secrete lysozymes. Panneth cells are secreting bactericidal enzymes. We have S cells, CCK cells, and K cells that are going to secrete out different hormones. We have that mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue in that lamina propria of that small intestine. So we have lymph nodules, Peyer's patches that we had mentioned. We have duodenal glands or Brewer's glands that help to neutralize these gastric acids. We have those different muscular layers. We have those circular folds within that mucosa and that submucosa. Again, it helps to increase the surface area to allow for the more absorption of these different nutrients. So we have this intestinal villi, which are projections. Again, it is increasing the surface area for absorption and digestion. We have capillaries, blood capillaries, and lymphatic capillaries. These blood capillaries and lymphatic capillaries are absorbing these different nutrients that are being taken up in our small intestine. So here's all these circular folds. This is how much, number one, that small intestine can expand as this chyme travels through it, but it gives such a large surface area to absorb as much nutrients as we possibly can. Here's these circular folds. Those are those finger-like projections that are coming up that are just helping to aid in that digestion or absorption. Here we can see a healthy duodenum. You can see all those different folds. These are just helping to secrete mucus to keep that intestine lubricated, secreting out different hormones, secreting out different immune cells. This is all working to help keep us healthy. We have these lymph nodules to help phagocytize any kind of bacteria or anything that may have gotten this far through our digestive tract. So, segmentations. It is mixing contractions that occur because of that distension of that smooth muscle as that chyme travels through. And that causes that peristalsis. That is that moving, those contraction of that smooth muscle that causes everything to move. So we have that salivary amylase starts breaking down those carbohydrates. The pH in our stomach kills that salivary amylase. Next, we get that pancreatic amylase that comes into the duodenum. It's going to break down glycogens and starches even further. Does not work on cellulose from plants. We get sucrose, lactose, and maltose. They do not start their breakdown until they get to that small intestine. They break down into monosaccharides where they can finally be absorbed. Proteins. It starts in the stomach with pepsin. Pepsin gets secreted as pepsinogen. The acidic environment of the stomach causes pepsinogen to turn into pepsinogen, which starts to denature and break down proteins. We have certain enzymes in that pancreatic juice, which is going to break down those proteins into peptides. Someone who is lactose intolerant, they do not have the enzyme lactase to break down lactose. So, since they do not have that enzyme, lactose cannot get broken down. So instead, we have bacteria in our large intestine that can break down lactose. But as these bacteria break down lactose, it results in gas, bloating, abdominal cramps, and nausea. It can happen 30 minutes up to 2 hours later. These people can get diarrhea from eating milk products. You can get diagnosed with a lactose intolerance by a hydrogen breath test, because when bacteria ferment this lactose, they release hydrogen. Hydrogen goes into our bloodstream and we can exhale it out. And we're able to measure that. Somebody who is lactose intolerant needs to adjust their diet so they're not taking in lactose, or they have these tablets that are called lactase. You take these lactase and it helps to break down lactose since you're missing the actual enzyme lactase. Lipids. We digest and break down lipids into triglycerides. Lingual lipase starts it, gastric lipase helps, and then we get pancreatic lipase. By the time these lipids have been broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, they get emulsified by bile fats so they can be absorbed. Nucleic acids, that's that RNA and that DNA. We have nucleosidase and phosphofatases, which can break down and help digest these two nucleases. So we absorb through our small intestine through a variety of ways. Things can just diffuse right across that membrane. Osmosis, so water, the movement of water. That's how we take water out of that small intestine. We also use active transport to help get some of these different nutrients across the membrane. So it just depends. Some things can diffuse right across, like amino acids, facilitated diffusion for some of those monosaccharides, short chain fatty acids, triglycerides, they can diffuse. Most of these particles will either end up in the bloodstream or they will end up in the lymphatic system. A lot of the triglycerides end up in the lymphatic system. Those proteins, monosaccharides, so like that glucose. Some fatty acids, very few, will end up in that bloodstream. So fluids. We secrete and absorb a lot of fluids. Most of the secretion happens from the mouth, the stomach, and into that first part of that small intestine. We absorb most of our liquids. We start at the small intestine and we finish it in the large intestine. So everything that happens in the between the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, and that small intestine are listed in this nice chart for you. Bariatric surgery. Bariatric surgery is a surgery that is supposed to help limit the amount of food that can be ingested and absorbed. There's 3 different ways to do this. Gastric banding. They can put a band at the beginning of that stomach. It helps a person feel full when they've eaten a small amount of food. They can adjust that band. They can remove that band. we have a gastric sleeve. That doesn't show this. A sleeve gastrectomy. There we go. So 80% of the stomach is removed. So this whole portion of the stomach gets removed. So you only have this little teeny tiny part of the stomach left. People feel full sooner. Then we have a gastric bypass. And again, it's going to decrease the amount of food that can be eaten by decreasing the absorption of nutrients. The stomach here is made extremely small. They kind of make this little tiny gastric pouch, and they bypass the duodenum. They bypass part of that stomach, and it goes into that jejunum. Large intestine. Our large intestine has what is known as haustral churning. So it churns what is released into it. It does peristalsis because it's trying to drive the contents of that large intestine or colon into the rectum. We have a lot of bacteria in our large intestine. That's their home. They take these proteins and they break them down to amino acids. They can even break down amino acids. They make some of our B vitamins, and these bacteria make vitamin K for us. We absorb water, ions, and vitamins. We form feces, and this is where defecation occurs at the end of that large intestine at the rectum. So our large intestine, it is everything from the ileum to the anus. So we have our cecum, the colon, and the rectum. The ileal orifice that I had mentioned before for where that small intestine kind of ends. This is where the small intestine, the end of the small intestine is actually opening up into the large intestine. It contains a sphincter again, or this superior ileocholic lip and this inferior ileocholic lip. This is what allows materials to pass. It's going to pass into the cecum. At the bottom of our cecum, we have our appendix. The cecum merges to form that colon. We have that ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon that I had mentioned at the beginning. The ascending colon is on the right side. Then we have this right colic flexure, which is where that colon is going to take a left turn. We go to the transverse colon, which travels from the right side of the stomach to the left side of the abdominal area. That left colic sphincter is where that colon turns down. That gives us the descending colon. That travels further. And then at the end of the descending colon, we get this sigmoid colon. It is this S shape as it travels down. That sigmoid colon empties into the rectum. And this is the end of the colon where we get this anal canal. So here's this ileum, and it has this ileal orifice that enters into this cecum. The cecum is the first part of that small or large intestine that has the appendix at the bottom. We get that ascending colon. Here's that right colic flexure, that transverse colon, left colic flexure, that descending colon, sigmoid colon, that turn to that rectum, anal canal to that anus. Each of these areas where these large gathering of like tissues is, where it kind of makes this inward curve before it goes back out. Each of these from like here to here That is known as a haustra. In our rectum, this is what I kind of skipped above. The rectum, we have these anal columns. These anal columns is this tissue that comes down. These make up the anal columns. Within the anus, we have an internal anal sphincter, which is smooth muscle, and then we have an external anal sphincter of skeletal muscle. The external anal sphincter is what allows us to control defecation. So here is this internal anal sphincter that's going to relax as that anus or anal canal gets full. That external anal sphincter out here is what we have control of and keeps that anus closed until it is time to defecate. Appendicitis. Remember that appendix is part of that immune system. And appendicitis is when that appendix gets inflamed. It could get obstructed by that chyme that gets released into that cecum. Something foreign could have gotten into it. It could kink. It could get stenosed. These people have a very high fever. Their white blood cell count is very high. It is usually their neutrophils. Pain starts in that umbilical region, like a ring around that umbilical region. It's going to travel down to that lower right quadrant. Appendectomy is the removal of that appendix, and that's usually what's recommended because it's the safest way to prevent a possible rupture. So, the histology of this large intestine here. We have a lot of absorptive cells, and then we have our goblet cells. We absorb a lot of water in our large intestine. These goblet cells are making sure that this area is lubricated. This coli, this is longitudinal muscles that are going to run along this large intestine, and then those haustra, they're pouches that kind of create these bands of this colon. And then we have this omental appendices. These are different outpouches. There are these outpouches that are fatty. They're kind of attaching to these coli. They come back up here. So you can see these omental appendices are these little fat pieces that come off. We can see these haustra that are coming through, and this coli, which is this kind of connective tissue that runs along this length here. Within our large intestine, we have a lot of different cells again. Again, we have all of these absorptive cells that are absorbing our fluids, or mostly our water. We have these goblet cells that are making sure that this area is lubricated. So it's secreting out that mucus to make sure that the contents can move pretty smoothly through. So these different cells are going to line these different areas to allow, again, movement of contents and absorption of water. You can see these different cells. We have a lot of these columnar epithelial cells that make up most of this lumen of this large intestine. Polyps. Polyps in the colon are just growths. They're benign. They usually do not have any symptoms, but sometimes they can cause diarrhea or blood in the feces. You can even get mucus discharge from the anus during defecation. They can remove them. You can do a colonoscope or surgically, they can remove these polyps if they're causing any problems. So when time passes from that ileum to the cecum into that large intestine, again, it's passing pretty slowly. We get this gastroileal reflex that's going to intensify that peristalsis and then the ileum. So any chyme that is not gotten into that cecum yet gets pushed through. So by the time food hits the stomach, we cause this gastroileal reflex. So when that cecum is distended, it causes contraction and widening of that ileal orifice to allow that cecum to pass through. And it allows more and more of that chyme to pass into that cecum. This haustral turning, they tend to remain relaxed until they become full. Once they've filled up, that it puts pressure on the walls, the contents in that next haustra get pushed along. So each time they move from one to the next, we do peristalsis. That's that mass peristaltic waves that are moving contents from one haustra to the next haustra, and it's kind of getting churned along the way. It can take place 3 to 4 times a day during or immediately after a meal. This peristalsis is taking place. The final stages of digestion are done in that large intestine. We do not secrete any enzymes in our large intestine. We're preparing for elimination. So we ferment any carbohydrates that are left. By fermenting, we're creating gas. By that hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane gases that are being released. Any remaining proteins and amino acids are broken down. Bacteria decompose that bilirubin into stercobilin, or that brown color of the feces. That colon is going to absorb vitamins. It's going to make some B vitamins and vitamin K. So by the time the chyme has been in the large intestine for like 3 to 10 hours, it's pretty solid. Most of the water has been reabsorbed. And at this time, it's feces. There's still some water in there. There could be some salts. We get those sloughed off epithelial cells from that digestive canal. There could be bacteria in there, bacterial decomposition products, unabsorbed digested materials. Any indigestible foods are what make up these feces. Most of this water absorption occurs in the small intestine, but there is still some that is happening in this large intestine. We're able to absorb some of those ions. Whoops. Sodium and chloride get absorbed, and then we absorb some vitamins still. So this defecation reflex, what is happening when it's time to defecate? So these peristaltic waves keep moving this fecal material through the colon, through the sigmoid colon. They start to push it down into the rectum. This pushing of this fecal material into the rectum causes this rectal wall to distend. It gets larger. It starts to stimulate stretch receptors. And that starts this defecation reflex that will result in defecation or that elimination of feces. So when that rectal wall starts to stretch, those receptors are actually going to send information into that sacral spinal cord. Impulses from that cord go on those parasympathetic nerves that goes to the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anus. And that causes contraction of those longitudinal muscles, those anal columns, to shorten. And that causes pressure. That pressure, with contractions of the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles, stimulates that internal anal sphincter to open. Of course, that external anal sphincter, it's voluntary. So once that external anal sphincter is relaxed, defecation occurs. If it's constricted, defecation can be postponed until necessary. So constriction of that diaphragm pushes down on that abdominal contents. Those abdominal muscles also aid in defecation. If defecation does not happen, that feces actually travels back up into that sigmoid colon until the next mass peristalsis stimulates that stretch reflex to go defecate again. Diarrhea. Diarrhea is because of the increase in frequency, volume, and fluid in the feces. It can also be caused by increased motility, and we're just not absorbing enough fluids. So if that chyme passes too quickly through that large intestine, we're not able to absorb enough. If we have frequent diarrhea, it can cause dehydration and electrolyte imbalances because we're not absorbing the nutrients that we need. Lactose intolerance can cause it. Stress can cause it. Microbes. Constipation, on the other hand, it's that infrequent or difficult defecation. It's usually caused by a decrease in motility because those feces remain in that colon for too long. If they're in the colon too long, we absorb too much water. If we absorb too much water, that feces becomes hard and dry. Could be caused by poor habits, holding it way too long. Spasms in the colon, you don't have enough fiber in your diet, not taking in enough fluids, not enough exercise. Emotional stress. Laxatives. The problem is laxative as a treatment becomes very habit forming. The better way to do it is to add fiber to the diet. Increase exercise, go for a walk. That's the safer way to fix constipation than using laxatives. So dietary fibers. These dietary fibers are indigestible plant carbohydrates. Cellulose, lignin, pectin is found in fruits, vegetables, grains, and beans. We have two different types of fiber. We have insoluble fiber and soluble fiber. Insoluble fiber will not dissolve in water. We find it in the skins of fruits, vegetables, even around wheat and corn kernels. This passes through the digestive tract, really not changed at all. So it helps to kind of speed up the movement of everything through that digestive tract. Soluble means it dissolves in water, so we form a gel. And it helps, or it slows the passage of material through that digestive canal. So beans, oats, barley, broccoli, prunes, fruits, citrus fruits. People who eat diets that have a lot of fiber in it actually may reduce their risk of obesity, diabetes, atherosclerosis, even gallstones, hemorrhoids, diverticulitis, appendicitis, colorectal cancer, Soluble fiber may also help in lowering bad cholesterol. So having fiber in your diet is very beneficial to us overall. So here's the different parts of the large intestine and how they help. And here is a nice chart that goes through all of the different organs and their functions of the digestive system. So let's look at the different phases of digestion here. We have this cephalic phase of digestion. And during this cephalic phase, the smell, sight, thought, or that initial taste of food is actually going to stimulate that cerebral cortex, hypothalamus, and brainstem. And what it does is it stimulates salivary glands to secrete their juices, and it gets your mouth and your stomach ready for the food. The gastric phase is when something hits your stomach. We have a neural regulation of it. So as that stomach gets distended, it stimulates stretch reflexes in the walls. We have chemoreceptors because they're monitoring the pH. So when the stomach gets distended or that pH increases, these stretch receptors and those chemoreceptors are activated and a negative feedback loop starts. This causes peristaltic waves to mix that food with the gastric juices, and these waves are eventually going to start pushing that chyme into that duodenum. So as the pH in the stomach chyme starts to decrease back down and the distension of the stomach walls lessens, we'd stop secreting out as much gastric juices. We have hormonal regulation. During this hormonal regulation, we're going to secrete out that gastrin. Gastrin can be released when the stomach walls get distended. Partially digested proteins can cause gastrin to be secreted. If we have a high pH in that chyme, even caffeine, acetylcholine. So chyme is going to get released out into the bloodstream, and it's going to reach its target organs in the digestive system. So gastrin is going to cause those gastric glands to secrete out their juices. It's going to cause that lower esophageal sphincter to contract and hold its contraction to prevent that acid reflux from happening. It's going to increase the motility in the stomach, and it's going to relax that pyloric sphincter so that food can pass from that stomach into that duodenum. Gastrin gets inhibited if that gastric pH gets too low. So everything kind of works on a negative feedback to try to return itself back to normal. Next phase, intestinal phase. During this intestinal phase, food has started to enter that small intestine. Of course, the nervous system is going to kind of regulate it, and it's going to be by that distension, those stretch reflexes in the duodenum. And that's going to cause that enterogastric reflex. So when those stretch receptors or mechanoreceptors get stimulated, it's going to send information to that medulla. And it's going to inhibit that parasympathetic stimulation and stimulate the sympathetic nerves to the stomach. It inhibits gastric motility. It increases the contractions of that pyloric sphincter to decrease gastric emptying. Hormones, cholecystokinin is because of chyme containing amino acids and fatty acids. So this stimulates the secretion of pancreatic juices, contraction of the gallbladder to release out bile. It relaxes the pancreatic ampulla sphincter, slows gastric emptying again. It provides a feeling of being full. It enhances the effects of secretin. So that's secretin. So when that chyme enters that duodenum, it causes the release of that hormone secretin. Secretin stimulates pancreatic juices that have bicarbonate ions. It inhibits secretion of gastric juices. Maintains that pancreas. It enhances the effect of cholecystokinin. It causes buffering of that chyme and that duodenum. So these are the three main hormones. They're major and minor effects and where they get secreted out. Ghrelin. Ghrelin causes you to feel hungry. Glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide and glucagon-like peptide. They both come from the small intestine because food is present, and it stimulates insulin to be released from that pancreas. Because our blood sugar levels or glucose levels are getting high, we need to lower those down. So when our digestive system is first being formed, it comes from the endoderm, and it's going to form what is known as the primitive gut. That primitive gut forms the digestive canal. We're going to get a foregut, a midgut, and a hindgut. The midgut is going to open into this yolk sac that will eventually become, that yolk sac becomes part of that placenta that'll eventually detach, and it kind of seals it off. So all of these cells, as they're coming along, we're forming all of these different layers that are making up our primitive gut. As we get older now, we're not able to secrete out these different substances as efficiently. The motility decreases, which tends to cause more constipation as we get older. That muscle tone loses its strength. That neurosensory feedback for those hormones and those enzymes can change. We'd have a diminished response to pain. You can lose your sense of taste, periodontal disease, difficulty swallowing, gastric and peptic ulcers, which are holes into the mucosa. Malabsorption and maldigestion can occur. So dental caries or tooth decay. This is where the teeth demineralize, and it usually affects the enamel first, and then it goes into that dentin. So if it does not get treated, this is where different microorganisms can actually invade the pulp, the inside of the tooth. Can cause inflammation and infection. Bacteria like sugar. When they ingest sugar, they produce acids. These acids are going to break down that enamel. Dextrin. It's a polysaccharide from sucrose that allows bacteria to stick to teeth. So these bacteria cells, this dextrin and other things can start to adhere, and this is what causes dental plaque. When you brush your teeth, it helps to remove the plaque before bacteria can actually produce these acids and start eroding the enamel and the dentin. Periodontal disease, it's a bunch of different conditions. There could be inflammation or degeneration of the gingiva, the bone, alveolar bone, the periodontium, and the cement. Pyorrhea, is an enlargement and inflammation of the soft tissues, and it leads to bleeding of the gums. So if you don't get that treated, soft tissue can deteriorate. That bone can be reabsorbed, gums to recess, so they go up higher on the teeth. You can lose your teeth. And it's by people who have poor oral hygiene. Peptic ulcers. I had mentioned peptic ulcers as holes. So they are openings or holes in the stomach, could be the duodenum is where two main places where they tend to form. And it's because of the acidic gastric juices that causes these peptic ulcers. One of the main complications is bleeding, which leads to anemia. It can also lead to shock and death. There's a bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, that can cause peptic ulcers. Taking too much NSAIDs, like aspirin, or too much secretion of HCl can cause peptic ulcer disease. Cigarette smoking again, alcohol, caffeine, those NSAIDs, even extreme high levels of stress can cause peptic ulcer disease. There's different antibiotics for H. pylori that can get rid of the bacteria. Those tissues can repair themselves. So they can happen in the walls of the stomach, or you can see them in the walls of the duodenum. That's usually the two areas that you're going to see peptic ulcer disease, because these are the areas that are exposed to the most acidic solutions. So here you can see how these different layers kind of erode away in this peptic ulcer here. Diverticular disease. So, and this is in the large intestine. They get different outpouching of the wall, these little sac-like outpouching that are known as diverticula. It's because this muscular layer has weakened. It can become inflamed, and when that becomes inflamed, it becomes diverticulosis, or the development of it is diverticulosis. When it becomes inflamed, it's diverticulitis. People with diverticulosis usually don't have any symptoms. They don't usually experience any problems, but diverticulitis is very painful. It can cause constipation, can cause that frequent need to defecate, nausea, vomiting, fevers. This is where diets in high fiber can be beneficial, because if you have a low fiber diet, you're more likely to develop diverticulitis. These diverticula can rupture and actually release bacteria into the abdominal cavity, because we have a lot of bacteria that live in that large intestine that line most of those walls of that large intestine specifically. Hepatitis. Hepatitis is an inflammation of the liver. It can be because of a virus, drugs, chemicals, alcohol. Hepatitis A is an infectious type. It's caused by the hepatitis A virus, and it is spread through fecal contamination. It can be mild in children and young adults. Older people, it's on the recommended vaccine list for people over 40, just because by this time, you're going to see a lot more effects from it. The nice thing is it doesn't cause long-lasting liver damage, and they usually recover in 4 to 6 weeks. Hepatitis B is caused by the hepatitis B virus. This is spread by sexual contact, contaminated syringes, and transfusion equipment. So it is through bodily fluids. Saliva and tears can spread it. It is present for years or for your entire life. It can produce cirrhosis and cancer of the liver. There is a vaccine out for hepatitis B. It's part of that normal vaccine series, that it's part of that childhood vaccine series. Hepatitis C. This is the hepatitis C virus, and it's similar to the hepatitis B. They can cause cirrhosis and liver cancer. Hepatitis D is another virus. It is transmitted by hepatitis B. Same way. You can be co-infected with hepatitis B before contracting hepatitis D. So you can end up with hepatitis B and hepatitis D. These people get severe liver damage. And they have a pretty high fatality rate. Hepatitis E is that hepatitis E virus, and it's spread like hepatitis A. It does have a very high mortality rate among pregnant women. So that homeostasis is everything that their digestive system, because we're taking in all of our nutrients. We're taking back in all of our water that is secreted out. So this is going to, again, affect every single system in the body. We're eliminating wastes. So this is affecting every single system in our body. And this is everything on the digestive system. Thank you very much for listening. And I will see you in the next recording. Bye.